The execution is over. The crowd disperses, satisfied or horrified, returning to their daily routines. But the executioner's work isn't finished. A body lies on the platform, sometimes headless, sometimes hanged, sometimes broken on the wheel. Blood pools on the wood. Flies are already gathering. Someone has to remove this corpse, clean the platform, and dispose of the remains. In medieval society, executed criminals occupied a special category of death. They couldn't be buried in churchyards. Their bodies were considered spiritually contaminated, tainted by their crimes and their shameful deaths. So what happened to them? Who handled the corpses? Where did they go? And why did some bodies disappear into darker purposes than simple burial? Before we uncover the grim logistics and unexpected commerce of post-execution disposal, if you're fascinated by the hidden infrastructure of medieval death, subscribe now. The most disturbing part is still ahead. The executioner held primary responsibility for body disposal. This was part of his job, explicitly stated in employment contracts. He was paid not just for performing executions but for managing the entire process from beginning to end, including cleanup and disposal. This task was perhaps more unpleasant than the execution itself, dealing with dead weight, decomposing flesh, and the physical labor of moving and burying bodies. The executioner didn't work alone. He typically had assistants, often family members or apprentices learning the trade. These assistants helped carry bodies, clean the execution site, and dig graves when necessary. The work was physically demanding and socially degrading. Even among executioners, the cleanup duties were considered the lowest aspect of an already stigmatized profession. Immediately after execution, the body remained on display for a specified period. This varied by region and crime. Some bodies were left for hours so crowds could view them as warnings. Others were removed quickly to prevent disturbances or because the execution site was needed for other purposes. During this display period, the executioner or his assistants guarded the body to prevent theft or interference. Why would anyone steal an executed criminal's body? Several reasons existed. Family members sometimes attempted to retrieve bodies for proper burial, even though this was usually forbidden. Medical practitioners sought bodies for anatomical study and dissection, and in some cases superstition drove theft. Parts of executed criminals, particularly hands or bones, were believed to have magical properties and were valuable in folk medicine and occult practices. Once the display period ended, disposal began. The method depended on the criminal's status, crime, and local regulations. Different crimes and different social classes received different treatment even in death. This disposal hierarchy reflected medieval beliefs about sin, contamination, and the afterlife. The most common disposal method was burial in unconsecrated ground. Every town had designated areas outside city walls where executed criminals and other undesirables were buried. These weren't formal cemeteries with markers or maintenance. They were simply open areas where bodies were placed in shallow graves, often mass graves containing multiple corpses. The executioner and his assistants would transport the body on a cart, usually at night, to avoid public attention and complaints about the smell. They dug a shallow pit, sometimes only a few feet deep, rolled the body in, and covered it with earth. No prayers were spoken, no markers were placed. The grave's location was remembered only vaguely, if at all. These burial grounds were grim places. With minimal depth and no coffins, bodies decomposed close to the surface. Animals sometimes dug them up. Heavy rains could expose remains. The smell during warm months was overwhelming. People avoided these areas, considering them cursed ground where the spirits of criminals wandered restlessly. Some regions had specific regulations about burial depth and location. Bodies had to be buried at least a certain distance from water sources to prevent contamination. Graves couldn't be too shallow, or scavengers would scatter remains. But enforcement was inconsistent, and executioners often took shortcuts when oversight was minimal. For particularly heinous crimes, disposal became part of the punishment's continuation beyond death. Traitors, heretics, and some murderers were denied burial entirely. Their bodies were left to rot where they died, whether on gallows, execution wheels, or gibbets. This served as public warning and reflected belief that these criminals' souls were so corrupted that even their bodies deserved no rest. Bodies left hanging in gibbets, metal cages suspended from posts, would decompose slowly over months. Birds and insects picked at the flesh, weather bleached the bones. Eventually, only a skeleton remained in the cage, rattling in the wind. These displays were intentionally horrific, meant to deter crime through visceral fear. The executioner was responsible for maintaining these displays. If a body fell from a gibbet, he had to replace it or secure it better. If bones scattered, he collected them. This maintenance continued until authorities decided sufficient time had passed and ordered the remains removed and buried. Some gibbet displays lasted years, the executioner checking periodically to ensure the warning remained visible. Another disposal method was dismemberment and distribution. For treason or rebellion, the body might be quartered, cut into 4 pieces, and each piece displayed in different locations. The head was often separated and displayed on a pike at a city gate or bridge. The executioner performed this dismemberment, a gruesome task requiring strength and sharp tools. After dismemberment, each body part had to be transported to its designated display location and secured. Heads were impaled on spikes or placed in niches on gates. Limbs were hung or displayed prominently. The executioner traveled between these locations, installing and later maintaining each display. This could take days of work for a single execution. Preserving heads for long-term display required additional effort. Some were boiled briefly to remove remaining flesh and leave mostly skull. Others were treated with preservatives like tar or salt. The goal was preventing rapid decomposition while maintaining recognizability as a human head. A decomposed mass served no deterrent purpose. The display needed to clearly show this was once a person, now dead as punishment for crime. Family retrieval of bodies was technically forbidden but often negotiated. Wealthy families whose members were executed might bribe the executioner to release the body for private burial. This created an informal economy around executed corpses. The executioner could earn significant additional income by selling bodies back to families. The negotiation usually happened before execution. The family would approach the executioner, offer payment, and arrange for discreet body release after the required display period. The executioner would then bury an animal carcass or rocks in the criminal burial ground instead, while the actual body went to the family for proper funeral and burial. This practice was illegal and risky for the executioner. If discovered, he could face fines or dismissal, but the supplemental income was substantial, and enforcement was often lax. Executioners developed reputations as negotiable on body disposal, and wealthy families knew whom to approach for these arrangements. The rise of anatomical study in late medieval period created another disposal avenue. Medical schools and private physicians sought bodies for dissection and study. Executed criminals provided a legal source of cadavers. Some regions formalized this arrangement, granting certain medical institutions rights to executed bodies for educational purposes. The executioner became the middleman in this anatomical trade. After execution, instead of burying the body, he would transport it to a medical facility. The institution paid a fee, sometimes substantial, and the executioner pocketed the money. This arrangement benefited multiple parties. The medical community gained research material, the executioner earned extra income, and disposal was handled without his physical labor. However, this trade had sinister aspects. Not all medical demand was legitimate. Some practitioners wanted bodies for experiments that even medieval society considered questionable. Body parts were sold separately to different buyers. A single executed criminal might be dismembered with parts going to various purchasers, creating a literal marketplace in human remains. The executioner's assistants sometimes stole body parts before disposal for sale on the black market. A hand, foot, or organ could be sold to occult practitioners, folk healers, or collectors of macabre curiosities. The executioner himself might participate in this trade, supplementing his income through piece-by-piece sale of corpses. Superstition surrounding executed criminals' bodies was widespread. Various body parts were believed to have magical or medicinal properties. A hanged man's hand, particularly the left hand, was sought for creating hands of glory, occult items supposedly granting invisibility or opening locks. Bones ground into powder were used in folk remedies. Fat rendered from executed criminals was believed to have healing properties for certain ailments. The executioner, with exclusive access to fresh executed bodies, was perfectly positioned to harvest and sell these items. Some executioners became known suppliers to the occult underground. They would discreetly remove requested items before disposal, selling them at premium prices to practitioners of folk magic and medicine. This trade wasn't just urban legend. Court records document prosecutions of executioners caught selling body parts. Inventories of executed criminals' possessions sometimes note missing body parts, suggesting systematic harvesting. The practice was officially condemned, but tacitly acknowledged as part of the executioner's shadow economy. The executioner's touch itself was considered contaminated and contaminating. Anyone or anything he touched carried spiritual pollution. This belief extended to executed bodies. People avoided contact with execution sites even after cleanup. The ground where blood soaked in was considered cursed. Buildings near execution platforms decreased in value. This contamination belief created practical problems for disposal. Carts used to transport bodies couldn't be used for anything else afterward. Tools used for burial or dismemberment were dedicated solely to that purpose. Even the executioner's clothing, if visibly soiled with execution blood, had to be burned or buried rather than washed and reused. The executioner's home, usually located outside town proper, often included a storage area for bodies awaiting disposal. If multiple executions occurred close together, bodies might pile up until the executioner had time for proper disposal. This storage was primitive. No preservation or cooling, just bodies stacked in a shed or cellar. The smell must have been horrific. Adding to the executioner's social isolation, animals posed constant problems. Dogs, pigs, and wild animals were attracted to execution sites and burial grounds by the smell of blood and decomposing flesh. They would dig up shallow graves, scatter bones, and drag body parts into town. The executioner was responsible for preventing this, which meant deeper burial, better covering, or constant patrols to chase away scavengers. Some regions required cremation rather than burial for certain criminals. This was rare because fuel costs were high, but for particularly feared criminals like accused witches or heretics, burning the body completely was believed necessary to prevent their evil from persisting. The executioner would construct a pyre, burn the body, and scatter or bury the ashes in unconsecrated ground. Burning bodies required significant amounts of wood and time. A human body doesn't burn easily. The executioner had to maintain the fire for hours, adding fuel and turning the body to ensure complete combustion. Even then, bone fragments often remained and had to be crushed and disposed of separately. This was exhausting work, and executioners charged extra fees for cremation disposals. The psychological impact of disposal duties on executioners and their assistants was substantial. Executing someone was violent but brief. Disposal meant prolonged contact with death, handling cold flesh, smelling decay, and spending hours or days dealing with corpses. Some executioners became desensitized, treating bodies as mere objects. Others developed drinking problems or psychological disturbances. The assistants, often young men learning the trade, faced particularly difficult adjustment. Their first disposal duties frequently caused vomiting, nightmares, and emotional distress. Experienced executioners had little sympathy. This was the job. If apprentices couldn't handle disposal, they needed to find different work. The profession had no room for squeamishness. Record-keeping around body disposal was minimal and inconsistent. Some executioners maintained logs noting where bodies were buried, more to protect themselves from accusations of illegal disposal than for any administrative purpose. Most kept no records. Bodies disappeared into unmarked graves, and their locations were forgotten within years. This lack of documentation means countless executed criminals from medieval period have completely vanished from history. We know they were executed because trial records exist, but what happened to their bodies afterward is unknown. They were disposed of somewhere by someone, but the details are lost. How did medieval executioners dispose of bodies after public executions? They hauled corpses on carts to unconsecrated burial grounds and dumped them in shallow pits where animals would dig them up. They hung bodies in gibbets for months until only bones remained rattling in iron cages. They dismembered traitors and traveled between cities, installing heads on spikes and limbs on display posts. They negotiated with wealthy families, accepting bribes to return bodies for private burial while burying animal carcasses in mass graves as substitutes. They sold corpses to anatomists and body parts to occult practitioners, turning disposal into supplemental income. They burned witches and scattered ashes in cursed ground. They stored bodies in sheds behind their homes, worked through decay and stench, and carried the contamination of their touch everywhere they went. Some bodies were buried, some burned, some dissected, some stolen, and some simply lost. The executioner managed it all. The grim cleanup after the public spectacle, the final degradation of criminals who died without dignity and were disposed of without ceremony. The crowd went home. The executioner stayed and dealt with what remained. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.